You know the saying, if you can remember the 1960s, you weren't really there. Well, I was a youthful and innocent spectator living in 1960s London, enjoying the pretty girls, ogling their avant-garde fashion, and above all, loving the music.
And this, Carnaby Street, was its epicentre. And the generation that gathered here was young and rebellious and experimental and part of the permissive society, which for some represented a threat to traditional British values.
The biggest threat, it seemed, came from the Rolling Stones. As tales of their excess filled the tabloids, stories of their drug use brought a crackdown by the authorities. From the late 60s to the early 70s, there was high-profile bust after high-profile bust. Why were the police determined to go after them? What happened during those arrests? The secrets are in these documents that remain sealed for decades.
What I have here is a Metropolitan Police file dated July 1973 of a raid that occurred in Cheyne Walk in London against Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg, who were discovered in bed together there. It is a great big, thick Metropolitan Police file, and it contains, amongst other things, a huge list of the things that were found there. Oh, my goodness, Keith, what a beginning. One Smith & Wesson revolver. Wow. Any number of tablets, white, green, brown, virtually every colour, goes on and on and on. Now, here we have some of the conversations, very tense conversations that took place between the Met and Keith Richards. A policeman says, "What's in this envelope?" Richards says, "Grass." "How do you know when I haven't shown it to you yet?" "Well, I guess it is grass, isn't it?" And then Keith Richards tries to imply that it belongs to somebody else. And then I rather like this. There's a moment where they're searching the house, and of course Keith Richards heads towards the bathroom, maybe to dispose of certain substances, and the policewoman says, "Keith, would you come back here?" He said, "Mr. Richards to you." Well, I wonder how Keith, Mr. Richards, would have felt when he was being charged with these offences, had he known that his friend and fellow Rolling Stone would one day become Sir Mick Jagger.
But this was far from a one-off case. By the time of that 1973 raid, the police had been targeting rock stars for 7 years. And driving much of it was a plainclothes drug squad detective from Scotland Yard, Norman alias Nobby Pilcher. He convinced his superiors to pour resources into investigating the rich and famous. Nigel Gunning, as a detective constable, worked for Nobby Pilcher.
He was a South London boy with a good CID officer's background. He was a great guy to work for, devoted to what he was doing. He was also quite charming, but could be very, very hard-nosed at times. But overall, he was very, very shrewd.
Was he, in any sense, a crusader?
He'd find a hook to hang something on. We will try and clean up London and deal with the drugs situation as we knew it then, which is now spiralled out of all proportion.
No rock star was exempt from Pilcher's attention. As well as busting the Stones, he arrested the folk singer Donovan and raided the home of Eric Clapton. His crackdown brought him tabloid fame, especially when he and his team targeted a Beatle.
You were involved in a raid on John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
Yes, I was. Some alleged drugs were found, which subsequently were analysed. John and Yoko were gathered up and taken out the front door, and suddenly we were surrounded by lots of still cameras.
Press photographers snapped John and Yoko as they were led out of their apartment and down to the station. How were the paparazzi there? The suspicion was that the police had tipped them off. And, as these formerly secret files now reveal, even the Home Secretary was suspicious, asking Pilcher why a simple arrest had involved 7 officers and 2 dogs, and why photographers were there within minutes.
It is notable that many of the raids on rock stars were accompanied by extraordinary publicity at the moment of the raid. Now, do you think anybody was tipping off the press?
That's a very difficult question. It certainly wasn't me. To answer your question, it's not impossible when you go up to the court, maybe somebody saw the paperwork and made a phone call, and the press would turn up with still cameras.
Lennon's arrest made headlines, but the biggest drugs case of all involved once again the Rolling Stones.
Well, baby used to stay out
In February 1967, the West Sussex force mounted a raid on a mansion. Inside were Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. During the operation, police found cannabis and amphetamines and charged both men with drugs offences. Cue a media frenzy.
Smoking cannabis resin, better known as hashish.
Richard, who earlier had talked in his evidence of what he called petty morals.
4 months later, the trial and guilty verdicts. The judge jailed Jagger for 3 months and Richards for a year. Stones fans were outraged.
Judge Block said sternly to Richard that the offence of which he'd been found guilty carried a maximum sentence of 10 years. There was a gasp of pure horror from the youngsters crowded into the public gallery.
In the event, after their trials, Jagger and Richards spent just one night in the cells before being released, pending an appeal. An appeal that was successful. Jagger received a conditional discharge, and Richards' conviction was overturned. Despite that judicial leniency, Pilcher and other detectives pursued rock stars for drug taking throughout the 60s and beyond. In 1973, Richards again became the focus of that extraordinary raid that I read about. I've come to where he was tried, the Great Marlborough Street Magistrates Court, now a restaurant. I've invited my next witness to meet me here. Simon Wells, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, Your Honour.
Is this or is this not the Magistrates Court where Anita Pallenberg and Keith Richard were tried on drugs offences?
Very much so. Way back in, well, it must be over 40 years now, emanating from the charges in Cheney Walk residence. 25 charges. I feel this was the last-ditch attempt of the drug squad to try and put a Stone in jail.
Once again, the attempt to imprison Richards failed. He pleaded guilty to the drugs charges, but the magistrates imposed minuscule fines of just £10 on each offence. So a very different outcome from the 1967 trial, where Keith Richard had received a 1-year custodial sentence.
By this point, I think that the steam had run out of the whole prosecution against pop stars.
Decades after they were pursued by the police, the Stones continued to roll, defying their age to pack out stadia around the world. But what of the detective, Norman Nobby Pilcher? Well, at the end of 1967, he found himself immortalised on vinyl. In the Beatles track I Am the Walrus, John Lennon supposedly refers to his old adversary as Semolina Pilchard. A bit of an indignity for a proud detective? Yes. But a few years later, things became a whole lot worse for him. What happened to Norman Pilcher in the end?
Well, he was found guilty on a perjury charge in 1973. He tried to go to Australia, but was deported straight back. And he was jailed for 4 years. And I think many people in the counterculture were clapping their hands with joy.